Welcome to an overview of Wisconsin agriculture. My name is Paul Mitchell. I'm a professor here in the Department of Agriculture and Applied Economics at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And this is the first of a two-part video series for AAE 320, my Farming Systems Management class. Our learning goals today are going to be to help the students become aware of some of the major agricultural products that Wisconsin farmers grow and their relative importance nationally, sort of where everything fits in. How as a state, where Wisconsin does in terms of our agricultural crops and livestock products. Also talk about the economic impact of agriculture here in Wisconsin and some of the current trends occurring among Wisconsin farms, both these with kind of a view towards ag business, given that a lot of the students in the class are ag business management majors. This is some USDA data for 2018. It's farmer cash receipts. This would be revenues that farmers bring in. This is their production times the price they get for it, the cash. These are the top 10 U.S. states in 2018. What you can see here, here's Wisconsin at number 9, but you can see California at almost $50 billion in 2018. And then traditional, what we think of as ag states here, Iowa, Nebraska, Minnesota, Illinois, Kansas, and then here's Wisconsin. $11 billion in 2018, just a little bit more than Nebraska and a little less than North Carolina. So you can kind of see we're on the list of players nationally in terms of our agricultural production. Wisconsin's, of course, a major dairy state. I think most of us know that. In terms of milk production, we're number 2 here. You can see the numbers. About 14% of the U.S.'s dairy, or milk production, I should say, is in Wisconsin, and California is number 1. Big thing is we are cheese makers. Cheese heads, our term. It's because we're the number 1 cheese state. We have over a quarter of the U.S.'s cheese is made here in the U.S., made here in Wisconsin. You can see American cheeses. We do about 20, not quite 20% of American cheese, like cheddar. Hispanic cheeses, I'm thinking queso fresco, we're almost 30%, but California beats us on that one in terms of total production. Then the Italian cheeses, mozzarella and Parmesan. You can see we're 1 and or 2 in those as well, roughly producing not quite a third of both of those, swapping again with California. And then when you make cheese, a leftover is whey. It's the fluids left over and you dry it down and it's whey protein. And we use that in a lot of different things for food, but also dry whey powder is used as a supplement. You see a couple different dairy cows here at the bottom just to remind students what dairy cows look like. You got the Holstein on the left here, and on the right is a Jersey. It's just some different breeds. Here's our livestock data now. We're going to look at Wisconsin's place in terms of livestock production. Cattle and calves were 9th at about 4%, with Texas as the number 1 state there. And what that is a mixture of cattle being sold for beef, to be slaughtered, to be fed cattle that are ready for making into hamburger or steaks. And then what we have very commonly in the state is a cow-calf operation for our beef farmers, where you have a cow, a mother, and she becomes pregnant, and then she gives birth to a calf. And you have that calf with the mother for several months, and then eventually the calf is weaned. And then that calf is weaned. It's not full grown yet. And what we commonly do is they put it on feedlots or out to pastures by themselves to gain all the rest of the way to a full market weight, what we call fed cattle. Well, Wisconsin, like a lot of other states, has a cow-calf operations, and we're 9th in that category, both for beef and for feeder cattle to put on lots or for other people to feed out. Number 2 in milk cows, which makes sense. We're number 2 in milk production. Again, California dominates us by a little bit. We have some small industries in livestock, hogs and sheep. Hogs and pigs, again, are going to be the mixture of fat hogs ready for butchering, as well as feeder pigs to be finished off by somebody else. Milk goats, we're number 1 in there. We have a goat dairy production here in the state. And it's not big in terms of nationally, but it puts us on the list in terms of being number 1 in dairy goats. Chickens and broilers. Chickens are for laying eggs, and the broilers are for making into chicken, that we traditionally eat. Iowa's number 1 in the chickens because they have a lot of eggs, and that's the next category here. And then Georgia is a large producer of broilers. We have Arcadia Friars here in the state, but it's not big nationally, but it's important to that part of the state. Another one that's surprising is mink pelts. Wisconsin actually has a fairly decent, on a national scale, mink pelt industry. It's not very many farmers, but we produce almost a third of the U.S.'s mink pelts here in the state. And then we have other crops like honey. People don't think of livestock as honeybees, but they are. And we're on the list there. We're 16th in honey production. but North Dakota dominates there. We've got 1.5% of U.S. production of honey. And trout is another one. It's both for stocking into streams and or freshwater, very clean ponds for people to catch, or for aquaculture itself to eat directly. In terms of U.S. agriculture, we're looking at our crops now. These are the grain and feed crops. Corn for grain is our major crop. The U.S. produces like a third of the world's corn, and Wisconsin's on the list. We're 10th in production of corn, not quite 4%. With our state across the river, the Mississippi River there at Iowa, is number 1 in corn production. But corn for silage, we're number 1 in. We produce 11% of the U.S.'s silage. And what silage is corn that you grow up and you harvest it earlier than you would wait until it dries down. It's still wetter. It's still fully formed. The ears and the grain is mature, but you mulch it up, chop it up early. It's called chopping silage, and you kind of see a picture here in the middle. This is silage bag, but there's other ways to store silage. But what you do is you harvest it, chop it up into this mulchy pieces of corn, the whole plant, from like a foot off the ground. And you ferment it. It's put in an anaerobic, airtight seal where there's no oxygen. And instead of rotting, it ferments. And the cows love it. It processes some of the fibers into more digestible things for cows. And you can see you've got different ways of fermenting it for keeping it anaerobic. You've got these large blue harvestors. You probably have seen those, or silos. They're the old stone ones or cement ones. The harvestors are the blue metal ones. You can put in these silage bags, are much cheaper. These harvestors are expensive and they don't last forever. These plastic bags work great. They can get very long, 1 to 200 feet real easily. You just blow it in and keep unrolling it as you go. And you can get pretty large diameter, 10, 12, 16 feet in diameter. But it's just a cheap, easy way. You might have seen these long white tubes in the ground. You use them for bales of hay as well. But this is silage bags. Or you can make these big bunkers here. You can see how green this is when it's freshly chopped. And then large volumes, they just push it up here, they dump it in these big trucks and shove it up and pack it down. And then they put the plastic on top. And a lot of times they use tires to hold down the plastic so it doesn't blow away. Other crops that are tied to our dairy industry include oats and forage of all types. We're 4th. North Dakota's tops in oats, and Texas is tops in forage. Oats in the state is important because it's used to help start alfalfa. And alfalfa is a slow growing, it's a tiny seeded crop, and it takes a long time to get to grow. And so often what you do is you plant a nurse crop like oats. The oats is growing up and you plant it at the same time as the alfalfa, but the alfalfa is down below in a very small plant. And the oats gets tall, you harvest the oats off, you can do various things. It's a good food for young animals oftentimes, more digestible and higher in protein. But then after you've harvested it, up through the stubble comes the alfalfa plants, and then you can even get a cutting of alfalfa off of it after you've harvested the oats. Of course, there's other crops. Soybeans and winter wheat are both our other 3 big grain crops in the state. And, they're 14th, 19th nationally. But, we're only producing 1-2% of the U.S.'s soybeans and wheat. But surprisingly, I think a lot of people aren't aware of that Wisconsin has a large vegetable industry. And this is what I call commercial scale vegetables. We have small scale as well, but potatoes, we're number 3 in the nation. Idaho, everyone thinks of as first and number 1 state. We produce about 6% of the U.S.'s potatoes on roughly 65,000 acres in the state, which is not that much in terms of surface area. We have 4 million acres of corn, but only 65,000 acres of potatoes. Sweet corn, green beans, and snap beans. These are our 3 big processing vegetables in the state. We're number 3 in sweet corn and green peas, and number 1 in snap beans, or the kind that are what we think of as green beans that are cut up into pieces and put in, often canned, or into soups. But you can see we're on that list of 13, 20%, almost 40% of the snap beans in the U.S. are grown here in the state. Another one is carrots. We have a large processing carrot. We have a few fresh carrots, but mostly processing. They end up in soups, like Campbell's soup if there's carrots in there. Or some of those frozen entrees you buy that might have carrots in them. California dominates in the carrots, but we have number 3 in carrot production. We could grow a lot of fresh carrots here, but we just don't. California's taken that one over. But you think of those cutter carrots, the baby carrots that you see that you often get, those are actually a long carrot that's cut into 3 or 4 pieces and spun to make it looks fresher and small, and that's what you baby carrots. We also produce cabbage. It used to be larger. All of a sudden, there's been a drop in cabbage acres in the state. I'm not sure what. California dominates. There's other states that participate, particularly in the Northeast. Fresh cabbage is popular. But think about our processing vegetables like sweet corn, green beans, and peas. What's a processing thing we make from cabbage? Sauerkraut is, think of brats and sauerkraut. Where we have a reasonable amount of sauerkraut production, and Great Lakes Kraut and some other companies. Cucumbers, we're seventh with about 4%. That's a mixture of fresh and for pickling. Again, we tend to make more of the pickling cucumbers. We have fresh as well, but most of them are going to be for pickling. Again, another processed vegetable. And lastly is pumpkins. We're 14th in the nation, but not quite 2%. But just down the road is Illinois, and they dominate the pumpkin production. That's primarily canned pumpkin to make pumpkin pie, but there's also the pumpkins for Halloween or fall decorations as well. Here's some examples of what these things look like. You got potatoes over here they've been dug already. You're just going to clean them up and put them in the truck. Here's some onions going up. I didn't talk about that. We have some dry onion production. Here's sweet corn being harvested to go into a processing to be canned. It's just husked. They have the machines in the facility. The plant will actually do the husking and take it off the cob after they cook it. Here's peas, and peas ripen very quickly and when it's warm. And this is 8 pea harvesters going through one field, one right after the other. Peas, you want to get them at exactly the right quality, because that's when they can really well. And so they harvest them very quickly when it's time to harvest. And so you can see this one field has got 8 pea harvesters going through. Here's what green beans look like being in a plant. You can see these are blanched, partially cooked. This is the part where they do the cleaning and such and getting ready. And then from here they go into the can, and then they're cooked more when they're canned. Here's the last one is cucumbers. You can see this is commercial scale cucumber production. They're all going into a large semi to be taken to a plant to be washed and graded and cleaned and be ready for pickles. Here's our fruit crops. Besides vegetables, we also have fruit. The 2 big ones in the state are going to be cranberries. We'll get to that in a second. But tart cherries, those are the sour ones that you're used to make juices as well as to make, think of cherries you buy for making cherry pies, not the ones you eat fresh. Those are sweet cherries. We produce about 4%, but just the other side of the lake is Michigan. They're the #1 tart cherry state. We have some apples in the state. They're not very much nationally, less than 1%, but we're 11th. Maple syrup, some of you probably had that. Bought it yourself. That's a northeastern thing, Vermont, New Hampshire, and places like that. But we're on the list at 4th, but it's only about 5% of the nation's production. Here's cranberries, our major fruit crop. We produce 62% of the nation's cranberries here in the state on roughly 15,000 acres. You can see Wisconsin produces about half of the world's cranberries here in the state. There's some other production in other parts of the world, but we dominate the world production of cranberries, and Wisconsin dominates the U.S. production. The last one is mint here. We're 5th in that. We used to be a larger mint industry, but that's been declining. More of it's moved to the Pacific Northwest, and some is in places like Indiana. But we still produce some. There's still a few mint growers around. The last one is ginseng. It's neither a fruit nor a vegetable. It's a medicinal herb. We eat the roots are used for in traditional Chinese medicine. But you can see some examples here, pictures of commercial cranberry production where they get them off of the vines and get them together, and they run them up through this. And there's some cleaning and sorting already going on here. This is a picture of the ginseng production. Ginseng likes to grow in the shade, and you can't go underneath all these wooded areas and clean them up. You can't use machinery. And so here they create artificial shade. You might have seen these black plastic, sort of that hanging about 10 feet off the ground with these wooden posts to hold it up. Marathon County up by Wausau is the major center of ginseng production here in the state. You can see this plant, these are the seeds here, these red berries. And then there's the plants grow for about 3-4 years before you harvest them. And it's the roots that they dig. And it's a very labor-intensive process. But traditional Chinese medicine considers Wisconsin ginseng the world's best in terms of quality. And most of it is grown here in Marathon County. And so we have export a lot of that. And it's a fairly labor-intensive, high cost. Wait a while, 3-4 years. There's a lot of disease issues. You can have problems with the weather wrecking your fabric and getting too much sun on your plants, etc. So it's a high risk, high reward industry. So we'll break it down here now as looking at our major categories just in terms of what are our major sources of income in terms of percentages to get at the shares here. So here's our same data, but we're looking at it differently now. We've got the year across the top here, 2011 through 2018. Our total cash receipts. It was 11 billion in 2018, but you can see it's been about that most years, 11, sometimes as high as almost 13 in 2014, but it varies a little. About 2/3 is livestock and about 1/3 is crops here in the light orange. You can see those numbers. And then you got your, among the livestock, dairy is almost half of all cash receipts. These numbers are always as a percent of all cash receipts. Livestock is 2/3, but dairy is literally half of all of our cash receipts. So it's most of that 2/3. Crops is the other third, and you see grain crops are the big one, roughly 20 to 25%. Then our fruits and vegetables. They're important nationally. You saw those numbers, 1, 2, 3, in terms of production, but in terms of the state's cash receipts to farmers, 4, 5, 6% total between fruits and vegetables. So potatoes might be big for certain growers, but on the grand scale of things, corn and soybeans and stuff like that dominates. Here's the same data now looked at in terms of sizes, not percentages. It's just all cash receipts. So that whole pie is 11 billion. And this is what part of that pie is milk or dairy, and then et cetera. And again, not surprisingly, dairy dominates at 46%. Well, you can see that's roughly half here. Beef is our next biggest commodity, and that's going to be both a mixture of those calves being sold after being weaned from the cows, feeder calves, as well as calves sold as now they're grown adults and they're fed cattle for slaughter for beef, to make what we like, steaks and hamburger. Our big crops, and let's finish up livestock here. The green is going to be eggs. We actually have a fair amount of eggs production, not nationally. Iowa dominates that, but you can see where it fits in. These other livestock commodities are here. Eggs, you got purple is the poultry, mostly chickens. We also have turkey production here. The blue is hogs. And there's some other livestock in there. That's where your things like mink and such fit in. You get corn and soybeans are our crops now. The rest of this is going to be primarily crops. Corn is our big one, and soybeans. Even though we're not a major soybean producer on a national scale, you can see it's our fourth largest ag commodity, our second largest crop, roughly 2 million acres, whereas corn is 4 million. Then you get these other grains in here. The green is hay, and the purple is going to be other grains. That's the wheat. But you can see we might have a reasonable amount of wheat. Corn, soybeans, and wheat is a common rotation in some parts of the state. In terms of dollars, there's just not a lot of money generated by these other grains like wheat, oats, rye, and barley. There's our vegetables right there. And there's cranberries and that orange are all fruits. And then there's a bunch of other categories that it's hard to classify, and the USDA just doesn't break them out. But they're going to be other crops. So you can kind of see, what do we have? We have cows. Well over half of our commodities are dairy and beef. So cows, cows and steers and bulls, soybeans and corn, and then vegetables. And everything else that's what dominates us. But we have a lot of these other little things. You're looking at just the specialty crops now. So go back, I guess, a slide. Sort of, we're going to look at this vegetables and that little piece of pie right there, that vegetables and that ochre-colored fruit one. We're going to break it down. What is our fruits and vegetables? Potatoes and cranberries. That's 2/3 of it right there. Potatoes are like 40%. Cranberries, another big chunk of it. That's where our fruits and vegetables are, specialty crops. And then we have our sweet corn, green beans, the oranges, cucumbers are going to be green peas, and that's where the cucumbers and the carrots and such fit in, but that's what most of the stuff is. The other big one is the green industry. Think of things like, flowers, obviously cut flowers, but the big one is going to be bedding plants in the garden. You go to the garden center, those garden center plants that you buy in the spring to put in your yard, they don't all come from Florida or somewhere. A lot of them are grown locally in greenhouses. We also have a sod industry to make turf, to put down and to move when you build. So whenever you build a house, a lot of times install sod. Someone's got to grow that. Sod can't be shipped very far, and so it has to be grown locally. And so there's a broad green industry. You can see it's actually more important than our green bean and sweet corn industry. Even though we're the nation's largest green bean producer, our green industry broadly actually generates more revenue. So here's a state. Now we'll look at Iowa. I've talked about it a little bit, and I grew up in Iowa, so I like to pick on them. I got my PhD at Iowa State, my bachelor's degree as well. So we'll look here at the slices, and I want you to kind of see here is how this state is much less diverse than Wisconsin. I'm going to go back 2 slides here to look at Wisconsin. So this is the same slide for Wisconsin. This is the slide for Iowa. You can see it's going to have the same categories here on the side, but they're going to be organized from the largest to smallest. Corn, hogs, soybeans, and beef. Corn and soybeans, pigs and cows. That's what they're dominated by. And then there's some chickens with the eggs. Dairy is this orange slice, and then there's this little tiny bits of some other stuff. But see how small that other stuff is after corn and soybeans, pigs, and cows. Here's Wisconsin, corn and soybeans, pigs and cows. And then there's a few pigs in here, but you can see how much broader this other part of our pie is here in Wisconsin. So I would argue Iowa might have a lot more billions of dollars worth of ag production cash receipts we saw in that first slide with the pie chart, or I'm sorry, the bar chart showing the relative size. Iowa was number 2, Wisconsin 9, but they're much more specialized into corn and soybeans, pigs and cows. So dairy is very important here. We got milk, obviously number 2 in milk, but cheese, we're number 1. Whey is a output from milk production, a byproduct, and we are major producers in all that. Milk cows, milk goats. Our field crops are silage. We're a major producer of silage nationally, but corn, oats, and forage. All of those are a big part of our dairy industry because cows eat silage, they eat corn grain. Oats is often used as a nurse crop for forage production. So we got all this tied to our dairy industry. We're also big in vegetables, though. Potatoes are number 3. Think of all those processing vegetables, sweet corn, snap beans, green peas, carrots, cucumbers, things like that. Fruits, cranberries dominates. You also have cherries, mint, and don't forget ginseng. It's not really, it's hard to classify exactly what it is. Really, what I'd like to drive home is Wisconsin has a fairly diverse ag industry compared to sort of more traditional ag states. And I'm thinking Iowa, but you can look at Illinois and some of those other ones. Very dominated, big producers of corn, soybeans, pigs and cows, beef and pork. So now what I'd like to do is we'll be ending this shortly. I just give you some discussion questions to think about here when we'll talk about this in class when we meet in person. But first one is just when I normally would present this in class, we'd ask about any of this surprising to you? What did any of this sort of new and interesting, what was surprising to you? Did you not know? Did you find it interesting? So do any of you have experience with these crops or livestock? I like to know just, what people have done. Some of you are from farms. You can tell me about it. I'd be curious if anyone's produced, grows mint or does potatoes or processing vegetables, sweet corn or peas or something. Think about what's missing. We've talked a lot, but you saw there's a big category other. Go back and look at that slide at the other crops that was listed for Wisconsin. It's fairly large. What am I missing here? What else do we do that's big? And then last thing I'll think about that Iowa versus Wisconsin, there's some advantages and disadvantages between being diverse and being specialized in ag production. Sort of a trade-off between specialization and diversification. So think about that. We'll talk some about it. But what are some of these advantages? What makes us better? What makes us disadvantaged relative to Iowa or other specialized states? So we'll stop here and then we'll have a second part coming up.